Though this review focuses mainly on narrative and thematic exploration through a Black feminist lens, this review assumes you have seen the show in question, and there will be some mild spoilers for episode 1. Proceed with caution. Hey, the Black Feminist here, bringing you my review of
Lovecraft Country.
episode 1. The first character we meet is Atticus. We're introduced to him through an embarrassingly intimate framework, the subconscious. After he wakes, we learn a few important things about Atticus. Aside from him being a Black man in the South in the 50s. And here are the top 3 things that really struck me about this character as I was watching the show. First, he's a blurred. His bookish interests are made abundantly clear before he's even technically introduced to us through the dream sequence. We're introduced to his relationship with his own people through this. The first instance is one that a lot of blurs are familiar with: derision.
Tell me, what's that book you've been reading about?
A Princess of Mars?
Mm-hmm.
It's about this man named John Carter.
As he explains the plot of the book that he was reading, she draws attention to the main character's history.
That's when it starts to get good.
Hold on. You said the hero was a Confederate officer.
Ex-Confederate.
He fought for slavery. You don't get to put an X in front of that.
Having your passions and interests picked apart by disapproving strangers and loved ones is a pretty regular part of the blurred experience. And his response reveals that he's dealt with this plenty of times before.
Stories are like people. Love them doesn't make them perfect. You just try and cherish them. Overlook their flaws.
Yeah, but the flaws are still there.
Yeah, they are.
After this, we're given the opportunity to experience the other side of the coin. Blurred acceptance and the joy of fandom. We see Atticus and his uncle looking over books they've both loved and reminiscing on the ways in which his father in particular was not only not accepting of these interests, but used them as tools of shame and punishment against his son.
On the creation of niggas.
Now that's one of Lovecraft's we don't hear mentioned often.
Pops made me memorize that poem. Word for word after he caught me reading this.
The second thing we learn about Atticus is that he's struggling with issues of identity and self-worth. Or to be more succinct, he's a veteran. Now, I know that feels like a reach. I'm a reaching. But hear me out. In this context, a Black man in the 50s who has the rights of citizenship, but no actual access to the vote. A man who is certainly very deeply connected to his community.
Let me get those for you.
But it's a community that disapproves of his interests in science fiction and fantasy. It doesn't take much effort to imagine the starting point of this journey. A young boy who loves to read because...
Book can't refuse your service.
Or spit in your water glass.
Because it's escapism from a world that doesn't want him. But not complete escapism. These works he's reading are fairly contemporary. They are written by people who, at best, have designed a fantasy world where he simply does not exist, or where the underlying metaphor of the work is one that dehumanizes him. Look up how the lost city of the jungle and the alien invasion tropes are both based in racist colonizer mindsets, if you're unclear on what I mean here. It takes a little bit of suffering, of shaving off pieces of yourself, to love stories that at best have no place for you, and at worst, advocate for your eradication. Then we have the real world he has to survive. A world of white supremacy, legalized genocide, and degradation baked into the bricks of this house. This world hates him and all that he is. It presents him with lies about himself used to justify this behavior, that the black man is lazy, that he's stupid. He's a sexual predator, an absent father, illiterate, uncultured, a spreader of disease and discord. Lie after lie after lie that you hear so often, you eventually begin to believe it.
Now raise your right paw and deliver the oath.
I, Nicholas Wilde, promise to be brave, loyal, helpful, and trustworthy.
Even though you're a fox.
What? Oh, oh. No! No! What did I do wrong, you guys? No! Please tell me, what did I do wrong? What did I do? No!
If you thought we would ever trust a fox without a muzzle, you're even dumber than you look.
Atticus, and the vast majority of blurs everywhere, has observed these things all his life. He has absorbed the messaging that is rarely stated out loud, but is everywhere. As he observes these traits in individuals around him, as he experiences derision from his own community for his willingness to sacrifice just a little bit of his own identity in order to gain access to a fantasy land where things are better, he thinks to himself, maybe if I try a little harder, I'll be good enough. Maybe if I sit up straight and mind my P's and Q's and follow the rules and don't talk back, they'll realize we're not all bad. Atticus's story is the story of the black security guard, the black police officer, the black overseer. He is the only black student in the all-white AP class, the black veteran. He's hungry for a seat at the table of equity, and he sacrifices great chunks of his own humanity on the altar of white supremacy in an attempt to earn his seat at that table. And when it's all over, after the trauma of the military-industrial complex and the ravages of war and experiences in a completely different country, he's no better off than he was before. And this brings us to point 3. The old soul. Atticus is tired. Atticus has done everything he can in a world that has no place for him to earn his seat at a table built on his back and the backs of his fathers and his fathers' fathers. And he's finally, forcefully, been made to accept the truth that the exceptional Negro is the one who serves the white man and not himself or his own people. The exceptional Negro is expected to work harder and longer than the white man, but is always sure to step off the sidewalk into the gutter when one passes him. The exceptional Negro has gray hair at 15 and ulcers by 25 because he's dedicating energy at all times to pleasing and capitulating to each and every facet of the white supremacist system. And he expects nothing for this. The exceptional Negro is a man that dies young and has nothing to show for it. And he is tired.
The name's not girl, it's Letitia fucking Lewis.
Letitia fucking Lewis. Now, some things might already be obvious here, but I'm going to say it anyway. I haven't read the book, and I don't intend to. At least not until after the show is over, and honestly, probably never, because I want to experience the unraveling of the mystery as it occurs, and I like putting pieces together on my own. Being wrong is often part of the joy of allowing your mind to wander a narrative freely. Another big part of the joy of dissecting media for me is the detective work of piecing together what things were done intentionally and what narrative elements are incidental or a product of the environment they were created in. Letitia Lewis is one of those characters where it's very difficult for me to tell how much of the framing was intentional and how much was essentially just a product of the society it was created in. So I'm just gonna note the most striking ways in which her character is framed, and I'll see how much of it is just me reading too much into the team's intent. 1. The high yellow bone. When Letitia Lewis steps out into the block party, I was struck immediately by how put together she was. She was the archetypal femme fatale. Her styling, her hair, makeup, and costume are all inhumanly immaculate. And if you've ever tried to dress up like that, you'll understand that this is the kind of work that requires hours every day. And in that split second where I'm parsing the visual language, I find myself trying to figure out, is that a white woman? No. But then we swing back to the party, a sea of diverse Black faces and dancing bodies, and her again, starkly pale in contrast to everyone else. I wonder again, is she Latina? Is she Asian?
Is that Letitia? Ruby, it's your sister.
Thank you, Floyd. I have eyes.
It doesn't take long to understand that Letty enjoys a different level of social privilege.
And stay 2 nights.
And what job am I supposed to find in 2 days?
You can get a job up on the north side.
I'm not cleaning house.
So what then? You think you're gonna go downtown and get a job in one of those department stores?
Yes, I do.
You think it's that easy,
Yes,
huh?
I do.
You know I've been applying for years.
Well, if I get the job, it'll be enough money for both of us to move.
Enjoys is putting it lightly. If you're at all familiar with the term colorism, then you understand that dark-skinned Black women and light-skinned Black women are treated very differently by our society, how we depict them and how we perceive them and how we treat them. I don't feel like this is necessarily my story to tell, so I won't, but let's just say there is a lot of baggage between these two girls. The dynamic between the two sisters is so brimming with potential for exploration of colorism and relations between white-passing Black women and darker-complexioned Black women. I've got my lived experience with being ambiguously ethnic and the alienation you can sometimes feel from the Black community. And the bottom line is that girls who get asked, "What are you?" have a level of privilege and access that is not available to a large percentage of Black people, and specifically Black women. So I find myself desperately hoping they'll really dig into the lopsided power dynamics that come to a simmer in every interaction between Letty and Ruby. 2. The Jezebel. The second, or let's be honest, the first thing that you notice is constantly being emphasized by the framing, by the costume and styling of Letty, is that if you haven't noticed, she is insanely hot. From the perfect shade of red lipstick to the lightly coiffed Black Snow White meets Betty Boop Bob, to the figure-hugging outfits, to the
Dress that short. You should be wearing some stockings.
She reeks of sex in every shot and from every angle. And this Jezebel framing is tied very closely to her status as light-skinned. If there is one detail about Letty's appearance that remains ever immaculate no matter how bad she's doing, it's that perfect, crisp red lipstick, which does a job in both prioritizing her sexual aesthetic and also, as any Black woman who wears makeup can tell you, finding a shade of red that looks like that is somewhere between hard and impossible. Not much to be said here. Letty is charming, she's inviting, and she's thin and light-skinned and seems to enjoy inviting sexual attention. She is, in essence, the Jezebel type. Her framing is closer to that of a succubus than a woman who is taken in by any particular man's charms. And all of this is done through framing, which brings me to 3, the revolutionary. Letty is an integral actor in the early civil rights protests and civil disobedience acts that paved the way for the later nationally and historically recognized movement.
Own house, maybe. There's a lot of colored folks pioneering into all-white neighborhoods these days.
What did you do with the money that I sent to you in D.C. 2 months ago?
I saved it, Marvin. It's what I used to get the bus to Ruby.
Not all of it you didn't. I'm not stupid, Letitia.
Fine. All right? I used it to bail some friends out of jail. But it's not what you did.
I'm tempted to describe her as on the forefront of the proto-movement, but the truth is Black people have been fighting for freedom since the day we were enslaved. Letty is the only member of the lead characters who is concerned with the fight for Black rights and racial equity. And I have a special appreciation for this because the role of the Black woman in the movement for Black rights is a story that is often relegated to the backseat of history. We talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s work, but we don't talk about his wife and her role in the movement. And we don't talk about the women who chose Dr. King from a list of reverends because he was best suited to be the face and figurehead of the movement that they had already organized. The same way that we discredit Rosa Parks and diminish her story down to one of an old lady who refused to give up her seat to a white person because she was tired. It's part of historic record that she was part of a team that was planning this act of civil disobedience to follow in the footsteps of another young Black girl who was considered unsuitable for the act because she was pregnant, and they expected the newspapers would turn on her for being unmarried. But Letty is not the painted saint we usually see in depictions of the civil rights movement, as noted in history books. She is not the perfect pacifist Dr. King. She is a very real, very flesh and blood, and very flawed person. Letty is nearly estranged from her own family and clearly has a history of asking for more than her fair share and being unreliable. She's here for the movement, but seems to struggle with standing by any one individual for too long. She's also allowed the freedom to be scared, to be angry, to be tired, to laugh and crack jokes and be proud of herself sometimes and ashamed at others. And I really appreciate the way that brings the past out of the picture books and into the real world. Because the people who have been on the forefront of this fight through the centuries have never been perfect. The fight has always been messy and confusing and roamed through shades of gray as we try to come together as a people, but still deal with our own internalized prejudices and privileges and culture. Sometimes you lash out in anger, sometimes you run screaming, and not every single indignity results in resistance, because maintaining the fight means picking and choosing which struggles are worth it and where the boundaries of the battlegrounds will be drawn. Uncle George! Uncle George rounds out our road trip crew as the driver. He's a publisher for the Green Book, which was and is still real. And if you're not familiar with it, that probably shaped your perspective on the character. George is a family man, a loving, dedicated husband, supportive father, and hard worker. It takes no time at all to realize that George has stepped in for Atticus to take on the role of the father figure he needed in order to cope with the realities of the man who raised him. George is a flawed man with a strong moral compass that points true more often than not. It's easy to imagine Uncle George is the person who introduced Atticus to science fiction and fantasy. He's a writer and a traveler and shared an understanding with Atticus about the mutual relation, his father, Montrose. Their chat is revealing, both in how he fell short.
Your pops was...
Was what?
He was younger, he was smaller. He took the brunt of it. I should have protected him more. I always regret that.
I was younger and smaller too. You ain't do shit to protect me. You regret that?
And why?
It's family business. It's not ours.
No, I don't want you in my house another night.
Uncle George also gave us the single best line of 2020.
You need to shoot him.
So he's now officially all of our uncles. Lovecraft Country. In summary, these are my first impressions after the first episode. Lovecraft Country is a narrative exploration of the themes of Lovecraft's work. I've only ever read a few of his works, but if you're a horror buff, there's no ignoring or escaping the legacy of his short stories and establishing the genre of cosmic horror, a type of horror that makes palpable the inherent horror of not mattering more than any other speck of dust in the cosmos. It's considered special in the lexicon of horror, not for the lack of jump scares, but because it's the story of a no-win situation. Whether the character that stumbled onto this path was a scientist or a scholar or a doctor or a priest or an astrophysicist, they are equally doomed, because the cards were dealt long before they got to the table, and they'll be there long after we're gone. Several things in Atticus's story sounded to me like references to a Lovecraft story I'd heard of plenty of times, but never actually sat down to read, because I'm not going to go out of my way to read the horror propaganda of a man who hated every element of my existence. So before I sit down to watch this episode with my roommate, who is an avid Lovecraft reader, I asked her to tell me the story of the Shadow of Innsmouth. And as she did, the connections became clear. My understanding of the story of the Shadow of Innsmouth. My understanding of the story of the Shadow of Innsmouth was always centered around the ending. The focus of horror on the notion of discovering something undesirable in your heritage. The metaphors there all translate very clearly into the real world. My friend's retelling focused much more on the beginning and the middle, as you should. A man who journeyed out into the middle of nowhere and had unpleasant interactions with a strange people. The town is ambiguously unsafe, and he is unfamiliar with the customs of the locals. But he's here for just a short time to enjoy the architecture and plans to be out of town before nightfall. And when he's unable to get out of town before sundown, the townsfolk come together to hunt him down, presumably to end his life for some unknown trespass. The Shadow of Innsmouth is the story of a white man experiencing a sundown town and a lynch mob. Cosmic horror, at its core, is about the fear of a white man's place of authority in the universe being stripped away. Lovecraft's nightmares are Black experiences, and Lovecraft Country is here to tackle the legacy left behind by a fiction-writing bigot with experiences of Black truth.